Hi, I'm Chineye Okoye. A cell is considered to be a living system because it is able to sustain its inside environment with a changing outside environment. In other words, a cell is able to maintain homeostasis. The cell membrane is key in homeostasis because it is the barrier between the cell's inside and outside world. So what are the components that make this possible for homeostasis? That is exactly what we're going to be discussing today. We'll be looking at the fluid mosaic model, membrane proteins, membrane transport, and briefly, cellular gradients. So here we see the animal cell model. We can clearly see that the cell membrane is what encompasses the entirety of the cell. So now let's take a closer look at the membrane. So the first thing to discuss is the framework of the membrane. This is simply the phospholipid bilayer, and it is made up of amphipathic molecules. These molecules make up hydrophobic and hydrophilic regions. Hydrophobic means repelling water, while hydrophilic means favoring water. So the hydrophobic region is actually on the inside of the membrane, while the hydrophilic region is on the outside. And so this membrane is considered to be a mosaic of lipid, protein, and carbohydrate. So in all, we call this the fluid mosaic model. So these molecules help the cell interact with the outside world. Speaking of interaction, membrane proteins are essential for cell communication. There are two categories of membrane proteins, and it's integral and peripheral. Within integral membrane proteins, we have the transmembrane proteins as well as the lipid-anchored proteins. The transmembrane proteins are embedded in the hydrophobic region of the phospholipid bilayer. And then we have our lipid-anchored proteins, which are covalently linked to an amino acid side chain here, in pink, within the protein. Then we have our peripheral protein, and is non-covalently bound to the region of the integral membrane protein that projects from out of the membrane. So the membranes that we just discussed and lipids can move laterally relative to each other, and the lipids itself can actually move or rotate freely around their long axes. And when we have things inside the cell that we want out, we can use a thing called a flippase, and that is basically there to required for the transfer of lipids from one side of the membrane to the other. So these are the components that make our membrane a semi-fluid. And so how is this maintained? So these membranes are actually stabilized by cholesterol. At high temperatures, lipids become more fluid-like, so cholesterol becomes more rigid, and this also happens the opposite direction. So in all, we now know the components of the cell membrane and how it is the barrier between the cell's inside and outside world. However, what if the cell needs things from the outside world, or needs to get rid of things in the inside world? That is why we have membrane transport. It is key to note that the membrane is selectively permeable. So this is key for essential molecules to enter, metabolic intermediates to remain, and waste products to exit. So what ways are these molecules transported? We have diffusion, as well as facilitated diffusion, and active transport. So basically, passive transport or diffusion is basically a solid is able to go through a membrane without any transport without any type of transport protein. Whereas in facilitated diffusion, the division of the solid through a membrane needs the aid of a transport protein that you see here. And another example of diffusion that's not listed is osmosis. And water, and this is just basically dealing with water. So water is able to diffuse through a membrane from an area of high water concentration to an area of lower water concentration. And if there are solids present that it cannot move, water movement can make the cell shrink or swell as water leaves or enters the cell. So the tendency for water to move into any cell is actually called osmotic pressure. And now we have active transport. So active transport basically differs from both diffusion and facilitated diffusion because it requires energy. because it is actually moving, the solid is actually moving upward against its gradient. So basically, it's moving from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. So this is energetically unfavorable, so it requires the input of energy. And we have two types of active transport. We have primary active transport as well as secondary active transport. And primary active transport just uses a pump with direct energy, whereas secondary active transport uses a pre-existing gradient to drive transport of a solute. So we just discussed the ability of transport due to the cellular membrane being permeable. So with molecules moving in and out of the cells, there's some sort of gradient that must be maintained. We have our transmembrane gradient and an ion electrochemical gradient. So in our transmembrane gradient, we know it's present when the concentration of a solid is higher on one side of a membrane than the other. And we have an ion electrochemical gradient when there is both an electrical gradient and chemical gradient present. So these gradients are actually possible through transport proteins. So we have two classes of transport proteins that are based on the manner of movement. We have channels, which form an open passageway for the direct diffusion of ions or molecules across the membrane. And then we have carrier proteins or transporters that need a conformational change in the protein in order for the salt to pass through. So this is also a principal pathway for the uptake of organic molecules such as sugars, amino acids, and nucleotides that are necessary for the cell. So, in all, we went over the fluid mosaic model, membrane proteins, membrane transport, and briefly cellular gradients. And in all, we now see how the cell membrane is key in homeostasis of the cell. Thanks for watching!